Have you ever wondered why the mind never seems to rest? Why peace feels close yet never stays long? Have you noticed how life can look fine, but something inside still feels unsettled? Welcome, my friend, and welcome back to Son.Mindfulness. I am grateful you are here today. Please stay with me until the end of this video. What we explore together may gently change how you see yourself. Many people live full lives, yet feel quietly exhausted inside. The days pass, the responsibilities grow, and the mind keeps talking. We try to fix the outside world, but the unease often returns. Why does this happen, and where does suffering truly begin? The Buddha offered a simple starting point. He said the mind comes first. Not belief, not philosophy, just looking. In this video, we will explore how understanding your own mind can soften suffering and open real freedom. No special skills are required. No perfect conditions are needed. Only honesty and curiosity. This channel, Son.Mindfulness, exists for one reason: to help you live with more clarity, peace, and kindness. If this resonates with you, please consider subscribing and supporting this channel. Your presence truly matters. I wish you good health, peace in your heart, happiness in your days. Now, let me ask you something gently. What might happen if you truly looked at your own mind? Not to fix it, just to see it. Let us begin together. Part 1. The mind is the root of experience. Let me begin with a simple question. Have you ever noticed how two people can live through the same situation, yet experience it completely differently? One person feels calm, the other feels overwhelmed. One feels gratitude, the other feels resentment. The world outside is the same, but in Buddhism, this is where everything begins. Not with events, not with circumstances, but with the mind. More than 2,500 years ago, the Buddha opened his teaching with a statement that still feels quietly radical today. Mind precedes all mental states. Mind is their chief. They are all mind-made. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Every emotion you have felt today began in the mind. Every reaction, every worry, every moment of peace or agitation. We spend our lives studying many things. We study our careers, our finances, our relationships, our bodies. Some of us study history, science, or philosophy. We know how the world works. And yet, most of us were never taught how the mind works. I once spoke with an elderly gentleman who told me, "I've lived more than 70 years, but I feel like I met my own mind only recently." That sentence stayed with me. Because we live inside the mind every moment, yet we rarely stop to truly observe it. The mind is like a lens. Whatever passes through it becomes our reality. If the lens is colored by fear, the world looks threatening. If the lens is colored by longing, the world feels incomplete. If the lens is calm and clear, even difficulty can feel workable. The Buddha was not saying that the world does not matter. He was pointing out something more subtle. The way we experience the world is always filtered through the mind. Think about pain for a moment. Physical pain is real. But suffering often comes from what the mind adds. The story, the resistance, the fear of what this pain might mean. Two people can feel the same physical discomfort. One suffers deeply. The other remains relatively at ease. Why? Because the mind is doing something different. Modern psychology confirms this in simple ways. Stress does not come only from what happens to us. It comes from how the mind interprets what happens. This is not abstract philosophy. This is lived experience. Have you ever noticed how a single thought can change your entire mood? Nothing outside has changed. Only a thought appeared, and suddenly the body tightens, the breath shortens, the heart feels heavy. That is the power of the mind. This is why Buddhism begins here. Not with belief, not with rituals, not with ideas about God or the universe. It begins with understanding the mind, because if you misunderstand the mind, even good circumstances will not bring peace. And if you understand the mind, even difficult circumstances become easier to carry. I want you to imagine something. Imagine carrying a heavy bag for many years. You assume the weight comes from the bag itself, but one day you open it and realize most of the weight came from stones you placed there long ago. The Buddha's teaching is an invitation to open the bag, to look inside the mind, not to judge it, not to fix it immediately, but to see clearly how experience is being created. When we begin to see this, something shifts. We stop blaming the world so quickly. We stop blaming ourselves so harshly. We begin to understand. This moment of understanding is gentle, but it is powerful. Because once you see that the mind is the root of experience, you realize something important. If suffering is shaped by the mind, then freedom must begin there too. And this is only the first step. But every real journey must start somewhere, and in Buddhism, it starts here, with the mind. Part 2. Most people live on the surface. Let me ask you something gently. Where is your mind right now? Your body may be sitting here. Your eyes may be watching this screen. But where is the mind? For many of us, the honest answer is surprising. It is not here. It is somewhere else. It is replaying a conversation from yesterday. It is worrying about a phone call tomorrow. It is remembering a regret from years ago, or imagining a future that has not yet arrived. This is how most people live. Present in body, absent in mind. We move through our days doing what needs to be done. Meetings, appointments, errands, responsibilities. From the outside, everything looks fine. But inside, the mind is rarely at rest. I once had a student in his 60s who said something very honest to me. He said, "I realize that I've eaten thousands of meals in my life, but I don't remember truly tasting most of them." That is living on the surface. We sit at the table, but the mind is somewhere else. We lie next to someone we love, but the mind is busy arguing with someone who is not even there. We walk through a beautiful day, but the mind is trapped in an old memory or an imagined future. This may seem harmless. After all, this is just how the mind works. But there is a cost. When we are not aware of what the mind is doing, it quietly takes control. Unseen thoughts shape our mood. Unseen fears guide our decisions. Unnoticed habits run our lives. You may notice the results, but not the cause. I have met many people who say, "I don't know why I feel anxious." Nothing is really wrong. But when we sit quietly and look, we often find the mind has been running in the background for years. Replaying old wounds, anticipating rejection, bracing for disappointment. All of this happens without asking your permission. This is what it means to live on the surface. Life is happening, but we are not fully there for it. And the tragedy is not dramatic, it is quiet. Moments pass unnoticed, conversations blur together. Days, months, even years slip by. Not because we were lazy or careless, but because no one taught us to look inward. In modern life, we are rewarded for being busy, for multitasking, for constant stimulation. Stillness can feel uncomfortable. Silence can feel strange. So we keep the mind occupied, television, phones, noise, anything to avoid being alone with our own thoughts. But here's the truth. The mind does not become peaceful by being ignored. It becomes louder. When awareness is absent, the mind fills the space with worry, fear, and endless commentary. Buddhism does not blame us for this. It simply points it out, not as a criticism, but as an invitation. Have you ever noticed that the moment you slow down, the mind becomes restless? Thoughts rush in, emotions surface. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that you are finally noticing. Living on the surface feels normal, only because it is common. But it is not inevitable. The Buddha taught that presence is trainable. Attention can be cultivated. And the first step is very humble. To notice when the body is here, but the mind is not. Not to judge it, not to fix it, just to notice. That noticing alone is already a movement inward. And when that movement begins, life starts to feel different, more intimate, more alive, because you are no longer only passing through your life. You are actually here for it. Part 3. Not knowing the mind leads to suffering. There is a kind of suffering that shouts, loss, illness, pain that arrives suddenly and unmistakably. But there is another kind of suffering, quieter, more subtle, and often more powerful. It lives beneath the surface of the mind. I want you to consider this. How many of your choices have been shaped by something you never clearly saw? A fear you could not name, a belief you never questioned, a feeling that whispered instead of shouting. I once spoke with a woman in her late 50s who said, "I have changed jobs 5 times. I have moved cities twice. I have been married, divorced, and married again, and still something feels unfinished inside me." She was not failing at life. She was simply looking in the wrong direction. When we do not understand our own mind, unseen patterns begin to run our lives. Fear of rejection can quietly shape relationships without ever saying its name. It does not announce itself. It does not say, "I am fear and I am in charge now." Instead, it shows up as overthinking, as people-pleasing, as withdrawing before anyone can get too close. A belief like "I am not enough" works the same way. It does not feel like a belief, it feels like reality. So we try harder, we achieve more, we prove ourselves again and again, and yet the satisfaction never lasts. Have you noticed this in yourself? That even after reaching something you wanted, the sense of relief fades quickly. Then the mind says, maybe the next thing will fix it. A new role, a new relationship, a new place to live. And sometimes these changes do help, for a while. But then the familiar feeling returns. The same restlessness, the same quiet dissatisfaction. Why? Because the source was never out there. I often say this gently to people. Wherever you go, your mind comes with you. You can change the scenery, but if the inner patterns remain unseen, they will recreate the same suffering in a new setting. Modern psychology sees this clearly. Unexamined beliefs shape perception. They influence how we interpret events, how we speak to ourselves, how we expect others to treat us. And when these beliefs remain unconscious, they feel unquestionable. This is why not knowing the mind leads to suffering. Not because the mind is bad, but because what is unseen cannot be understood. What is not understood cannot be cared for. Imagine driving a car with a warning light constantly blinking, but you never look under the hood. You keep driving. You keep adjusting the route. You keep blaming the road. Meanwhile, the real issue remains untouched. This is how many people live with their inner world. They manage symptoms, they cope, they endure. But they rarely pause long enough to ask, what is actually happening inside me? This is not a moral failure. It is a lack of training. No one taught us to recognize fear as fear, to see belief as belief, to notice patterns before they harden into identity. Buddhism does not promise a life without difficulty. It promises something more realistic. Clarity. When fear is seen clearly, it loses some of its power. When a belief is recognized as a belief, it stops masquerading as truth. This does not happen all at once. It happens gently, moment by moment. But even the first glimpse changes something. You begin to realize, maybe I am not broken. Maybe I have just been listening to the same unseen story for years. And that realization brings relief. Because if suffering is being created inside the mind, then understanding the mind is not self-indulgent. It is necessary. And this understanding is the doorway, not to perfection, but to a kinder way of living with yourself. Part 4. The first step is simple. Observe, when people first hear the Buddhist teachings, many assume the path must begin with discipline, with control, with effort. They think, I must calm my mind, I must stop negative thoughts, I must get rid of anger, fear, or sadness. But this is not where the Buddha began. He did not start by telling us to fix the mind. He did not tell us to control it. He did not even tell us to change it. He asked us to do something far simpler and far more difficult. to observe, just to see what is actually happening. This is surprising for many people because we are trained to act, to manage, to improve. If something feels uncomfortable, we try to push it away. If something feels pleasant, we try to hold on to it. But observation asks for something different. It asks for honesty without judgment. I often tell my students this. Before you try to change anything, first learn how to look, because what you do not see clearly, you cannot relate to wisely. Have you ever tried to fix a problem without fully understanding it? It usually creates more problems. The Buddha understood this deeply. He taught that the mind does what it does based on conditions. Thoughts arise, emotions appear, sensations come and go, not because we command them, but because the right conditions have come together. So the practice begins with noticing. A thought appears, you notice it. An emotion arises, you feel it in the body. A reaction forms, you see the impulse before it becomes action. Nothing more is required at first. This may sound passive, but it is not. Observation is an active form of presence. It takes courage to stay with what is happening instead of escaping into distraction. It takes patience to watch discomfort without immediately trying to fix it. I remember a man in his 70s who once said to me, "I thought meditation would make my mind quiet. Instead, it showed me how busy it already was." That is not failure. That is success. Seeing clearly is always the first victory. When you observe the mind, you begin to notice patterns. You see how one thought leads to another, how a memory triggers an emotion, how an emotion tightens the body. You begin to see the chain of cause and effect as it happens in real time. And something subtle starts to change. You are no longer completely inside the experience. You are also aware of it. There is the thought, and there is the knowing of the thought. There is the emotion, and there is the awareness that feels it. This small separation is not cold or distant. It is spacious. It gives you room to breathe. The Buddha never said, "Do not feel anger." He said, "Know when anger is present." He never said, "Do not feel desire." He said, "Know when desire is present." This knowing is not approval, and it is not rejection. It is clarity. Think about how you would care for a child. If the child is upset, you do not yell at them for feeling upset. You stay close. You pay attention. Observation is like that. It is a form of kindness toward your own inner life. At first, this practice may feel uncomfortable. You may notice thoughts you do not like, feelings you would rather avoid. But remember this: what you are seeing was already there. You are not creating it. You are simply becoming aware of it, and awareness changes the relationship. When you see clearly, you suffer less blindly. You may still feel pain, but there is less confusion, less self-blame, less fear. This is why the first step is so important, not because it solves everything immediately, but because without seeing, there is no real freedom. And the Buddha knew this. That is why the path begins here, with observation, with seeing things as they are. Part 5. Feelings and thoughts are impermanent. As you continue to observe the mind, something very important begins to reveal itself. Not as an idea, not as a belief, but as a direct experience. Nothing in the mind stays the same. At first, this may seem obvious. Of course, thoughts change. Of course, emotions come and go. But knowing this intellectually and seeing it clearly in your own experience are very different things. I want you to imagine sitting quietly for just a few minutes. You are not trying to relax. You are not trying to meditate perfectly. You are simply watching. A thought appears. It feels important, urgent. It asks for your attention. And then if you keep watching, it fades. Another thought takes its place. That one fades too. An emotion arises, maybe irritation, maybe sadness, maybe restlessness. You feel it in the body. The chest tightens, the jaw clenches, the breath changes. And then, without you doing anything, it begins to shift. It softens, it moves, it passes. This is impermanence. The Buddha often compared the mind to a river, always flowing, always changing, never quite the same from one moment to the next. We suffer because we forget this. When anger arises, it feels permanent. We think, this is me, this will always be here. When anxiety appears, the mind says, something is wrong. I am broken. But if you stay and watch, you discover something quietly reassuring. Even the strongest emotion cannot hold its shape forever. I once worked with a man who was deeply afraid of his anger. He told me, when anger comes, I feel like I will lose control. So he spent his life trying to suppress it, avoiding it, judging himself for it. One day I asked him to try something different. Not to act on the anger, not to push it away, just to stay with it and observe. He came back later and said, it rose like a wave, Nora, and then it broke. That moment changed his life. Not because anger never returned, but because he no longer believed it defined him. Impermanence is not a theory. It is something you can see right now. Joy arises. It feels wonderful. We want it to stay. But it does not ask for our permission. It changes. It fades. This can feel disappointing at first, but there is another way to see it. If joy were permanent, we would cling to it desperately. If pain were permanent, we would be trapped forever. The fact that everything changes is not a problem. It is the reason freedom is possible. Modern neuroscience supports this in a simple way. Emotions are patterns of activity in the brain and body. They are dynamic. They shift as conditions change. But we often treat them as solid truths. We say, I am an anxious person, I am an angry person, I am a depressed person. Buddhism invites a gentler language. Anxiety is here right now. Anger is present in this moment. Sadness is visiting. Notice the difference. One makes the experience permanent. The other allows movement. When you stop clinging to pleasant states and stop pushing away unpleasant ones, something very subtle happens. You suffer less. Not because life stops being difficult, but because you stop fighting reality. You learn to ride the river instead of trying to freeze it. This does not make you passive. It makes you wise. You still respond. You still act, but you do so with less fear. Because you know from experience that whatever is here now will not stay forever. And this knowing brings relief, it brings patience, it brings humility, and most of all it brings trust. Trust in the changing nature of the mind. Trust that no storm lasts forever. This understanding does not come from believing the Buddha. It comes from watching your own experience closely. And once you see it, even briefly, you never forget it. Because you have seen the river for yourself. Part 6. Awareness is not control. As people begin to notice that thoughts and emotions come and go, another habit often appears quietly in the mind. The habit of control. We think, now that I see anger, I should get rid of it. Now that I notice fear, I should calm it down. Now that I understand impermanence, I should only feel peace. This is very human and very understandable. But this is not what the Buddha taught. In one of the most important meditation teachings, the Satipatthana Sutta, the instruction is surprisingly simple. When the mind has desire, one knows it. When the mind has anger, one knows it. When the mind is free from anger, one knows that too. Notice what is missing. There is no command, no judgment, no instruction to suppress or replace what is present, just knowing. This can feel unsettling at first, because many of us were raised to believe that a good person should not feel certain emotions. We learn to say, I shouldn't be angry, I shouldn't feel jealous, I shouldn't feel this way at my age. So when these states arise, we don't just feel them, we fight them. And that fight creates a second layer of suffering. I often tell people this, the emo itself is rarely the biggest problem, the resistance to it is. Have you ever noticed this in yourself? Anger arises, and then shame follows. Fear appears, and then judgment. The mind says, what's wrong with me? Why am I still like this? This is not awareness. This is control disguised as self-improvement. The Buddha offered a different path, to see clearly without adding commentary. Awareness means allowing what is present to be known as it is, not exaggerating it, not pushing it away, not pretending it isn't there, just knowing. This kind of awareness is deeply respectful. It treats the mind as something to understand, not something to dominate. Think of it like turning on a light in a dark room. You don't chase the shadows. You don't argue with them. You simply see what is there. And in that seeing, much of the fear loses its power. I once worked with a man who had spent decades trying to control his anger. He believed that spirituality meant never feeling it, but the more he tried to suppress it, the stronger it became. When he finally learned to say, "Anger is here," without judgment, without action, something softened. The anger still came, but it stayed for a shorter time, because it was no longer being fed by resistance. Modern psychology echoes this wisdom. Emotions that are allowed and acknowledged tend to move through the system more quickly. Emotions that are suppressed often return with greater intensity. Awareness is not weakness. It is not indulgence. It is strength rooted in clarity. When you are aware, you gain choice. Without awareness, the emotion takes over. With awareness, there is a pause. And in that pause, you are no longer possessed. This is the great misunderstanding. People fear that if they stop controlling the mind, they will lose control of their life. In truth, they lose control only when they are unaware. Awareness does not mean acting out every impulse. It means seeing the impulse clearly before deciding what to do. This is a very mature form of freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you feel, but the freedom to respond wisely. When the Buddha emphasized knowing rather than fixing, he was pointing to this exact freedom. A freedom that comes from clarity, not force, from understanding, not suppression. And this shift changes the entire relationship with the mind. You stop treating emotions as enemies. You stop treating thoughts as commands. They become experiences, visitors, known, seen, and allowed to pass. This is not the end of the path, but it is a profound turning point, because when awareness replaces control, the mind begins to trust itself, and that trust opens the door to a deeper, steadier peace. Part 7. Observation creates space. As awareness deepens, something very subtle begins to happen. You may not notice it right away, but one day you realize that your inner world feels different, not quieter in a dramatic way, not perfectly peaceful, just more spacious. There is still anger, still fear, still desire, but they no longer fill the entire room. I want you to imagine this. You are standing in a small room with no windows. An emotion enters, strong and loud. There is nowhere to move, nowhere to breathe. That is what life feels like when we are identified with our emotions. But when observation is present, it is as if the walls begin to move outward. The emotion is still there, but there is space around it. This space changes everything. The Buddha spoke often about this gap, the moment between feeling and reacting. Before awareness, anger arises and becomes speech. Fear arises and becomes avoidance. Desire arises and becomes action. There is no pause. Later we say, "I don't know what came over me." But when awareness is present, something interrupts this chain. Anger arises and you notice it. You feel it in the body, the heat, the tightening, but you do not immediately become it. There is a moment of knowing. Anger is here. That moment may be very brief, just a breath, just a second. But in that moment you are no longer fully possessed, you are witnessing. This is not suppression. It is not denial. It is clarity. And clarity creates space. I once worked with a woman who struggled deeply in her relationship with her adult son. Every conversation seemed to turn into conflict. She told me, "The moment he speaks, I feel attacked, and then I explode." We worked very gently with observation. Not to change her son, not even to change her emotions, only to notice what happened inside her the moment she felt threatened. Weeks later, she said something remarkable. She said, "For the first time, I felt the anger rise, and I didn't speak right away. I just felt it. And in that pause, I realized how afraid I was. That pause saved the conversation." This is what the Buddha meant by freedom, not freedom from emotions, but freedom in the presence of them. When there is space, you can choose. You may still speak firmly, you may still set boundaries, you may still say no, but you are responding, not reacting. This distinction matters deeply. Reaction comes from habit. Response comes from awareness. One is automatic, the other is conscious. And this space does not only help in difficult moments, it also changes how you experience pleasant ones. When joy arises, you can enjoy it fully without clinging. When peace appears, you can appreciate it without fearing its loss, because you understand its nature. Everything that arises will pass, and because of that, you don't need to grasp so tightly. Modern neuroscience describes something similar. When awareness is present, the brain's reactive circuits quiet down. The prefrontal areas involved in reflection become active. But you do not need to know the science to feel the difference. You feel it in your body, in your breath, in the way situations no longer hijack you so easily. This space is not cold. It is not detached. It is warm. It is alive. It allows compassion to arise. When you see your own reactions clearly, you begin to recognize them in others. You see fear behind anger. You see longing behind control. And instead of hardening, the heart softens. This is why observation is so powerful. It does not make you less human, it makes you more human, less driven by habit, more guided by understanding. And all of this begins with a very small shift. From being inside the storm to standing just one step back and watching the storm move through. That step back is not escape, it is freedom. Part 8. The self is a process, not a thing. As you continue to observe the mind with patience and honesty, a very natural question begins to arise. It does not come as a philosophical puzzle. It comes as a quiet curiosity. If thoughts come and go, and I am still here, if emotions arise and pass, and I am still here, then what exactly is this I keep referring to? Most of us have lived our entire lives assuming there's a solid self somewhere inside, a center, a controller, an owner of experience. We say, I am angry, I am afraid, I am happy, but when you look closely, what do you actually find? The Buddha encouraged people not to believe his answer, but to look for themselves, and when we do, something surprising appears. Instead of finding one solid thing called me, we find movement, sensations in the body, warmth, tension, pleasure, pain, feelings arising pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, perceptions labeling experience. This is familiar. This is threatening. This is boring. Impulses forming, wanting, resisting, hesitating. And all of this is known by awareness, flowing, changing, moment by moment. What we call I is this whole process happening in real time, so seamless, so fast that it feels like a single thing. But when you slow down and observe, you begin to see the parts. This can feel unsettling at first, especially for people who have spent a lifetime defining themselves through roles and identity. Parent, professional, provider, caregiver. A man once said to me, "If I am not my thoughts and emotions, then who am I?" It is a very honest question. The Buddha did not answer it with a new identity. He did not replace the old self with a better one. He simply said, "Look." And when people looked carefully, they discovered something gentle and liberating. There is still experience, there is still personality, there is still memory and responsibility, but there is less weight. Because the self is no longer held as a rigid thing that must be defended at all costs. Think about how much suffering comes from this rigidity. Someone criticizes you, and it feels like an attack on who you are. Someone disagrees with you, and it feels threatening. Someone changes, and you feel abandoned. Why? Because we are protecting an idea of self that we believe must remain intact. But when you begin to see the self as a process, something loosens. Thoughts are no longer orders. Emotions are no longer definitions. They are events, passing experiences within a much larger field of awareness. Modern science sees this too. The brain does not contain a single center called the self. It is a network of processes constantly updating and responding. Buddhism saw this long ago, not through machines, but through careful observation of lived experience. This understanding does not erase responsibility. You still act. You still choose. You still care. But you do so with less fear, because there is less to protect. You do not have to defend every emotion. You do not have to justify every reaction. You can allow experience to move without taking it so personally. This does not make you distant from life. It makes you more intimate with it. You feel more. But you suffer less, because you are no longer clinging to a fixed idea of who you must be. Instead, you are participating in a living, changing process, breathing, feeling, knowing, moment by moment. And this insight does not arrive suddenly for most people. It unfolds slowly, like ice melting. At first you still feel solid, then slightly softer, then more fluid. And with that fluidity comes relief, less defensiveness, less self-judgment, less fear of change, because you realize something quietly profound. You were never a thing to begin with. You were always a process, alive, responsive, unfolding. And when you see this for yourself, not as a belief, but as a direct experience, the heart rests a little more easily in the world. Part 9. Seeing your mind changes how you relate to others. Something very quiet begins to happen as you spend time observing your own mind. You may not notice it at first. It does not announce itself. But one day you realize that the way you see other people has changed. Not because you decided to be more compassionate, not because you reminded yourself to be kind. It happens naturally. When you have watched your own mind wander, your own fears arise, your own emotions take over and then pass, you begin to recognize something familiar in others. You see yourself. I often tell people this. The more clearly you see your own confusion, the less shocking it becomes in someone else. Think about a difficult person in your life, someone who reacts strongly, someone who is defensive, critical, or withdrawn. Before practice, it is easy to see only their behavior. But after observing your own inner world, you begin to sense what may be underneath. Fear, insecurity, a longing to be understood, not as an excuse but as an explanation. I once spoke with a man who struggled deeply with resentment toward his brother. Every interaction felt tense. Every conversation reopened old wounds. As he began to observe his own mind, he noticed something surprising. Each time his brother spoke, his own body tightened. A familiar story appeared. I am not respected. I am invisible. When he saw this clearly, his anger softened. Not because his brother changed, but because he understood what was happening inside himself. And then something else happened. He began to wonder, what must my brother be carrying? This question did not come from obligation. It came from recognition. This is how compassion is born in Buddhism. Not from ideals, not from moral pressure, but from seeing clearly. When you observe your own suffering honestly, you realize how universal it is. Everyone wants to feel safe, everyone wants to be valued, everyone wants to avoid pain, and everyone's mind wanders. Everyone gets lost in stories, everyone reacts without meaning to. When you see this in yourself, you stop expecting perfection from others. You still set boundaries. You still speak honestly. You still protect yourself when needed. But your heart is less hardened. This kind of compassion is very different from pity. It does not place you above anyone. It places you beside them. I often say this to my students. Compassion is not something you add on top of practice. It grows out of practice. When you see your own fear, you recognize fear in others. When you see how your own mind creates suffering, you understand how easily suffering arises everywhere. This understanding changes conversations. You listen more deeply, you interrupt less quickly, you pause before reacting. And even when conflict remains, there is more humanity in it. Modern psychology supports this in a simple way. People who develop self-awareness tend to show greater empathy, not because they are nicer people, but because they understand inner experience more clearly. They know what it feels like to be overwhelmed, to be triggered, to act from habit rather than wisdom. So when someone else does the same, they are less shocked, less judgmental. This does not mean you tolerate harmful behavior. Compassion is not passivity. It means you respond with understanding rather than blind reaction. And this changes the quality of your life. Relationships become less exhausting. Conflicts become less personal. You stop carrying so much resentment. Not because others suddenly improve, but because you no longer need them to be different in order for your heart to remain open. The Buddha often spoke of compassion as a natural response to understanding. When ignorance fades, kindness appears, not forced, not rehearsed, but genuine. And it begins very close to home, by seeing your own mind clearly. When you do this, you begin to walk through the world with a quieter heart. You recognize that everyone you meet is navigating their own inner weather. Some storms are visible, others are hidden, but they are there. And when you see this, something softens. You may still disagree. You may still walk away. But you no longer need to harden yourself in order to do so. This is one of the most beautiful fruits of practice. Not a withdrawal from the world, but a deeper connection to it, rooted in understanding, expressed as compassion. Part 10. Practice begins where you are. After everything we have explored together, it would be easy to think that this path belongs to monks or to people with quiet lives and plenty of time. But the Buddha's final instruction is very simple and very reassuring. You begin exactly where you are, not where you think you should, not where you were years ago, not where you hope to be one day. Right here. You do not need a new belief system. You do not need to understand Buddhist philosophy. You do not need special abilities or ideal conditions. You only need to pause, just for a moment, and notice. Notice where your body is. Notice where your mind is. Is it here, or has it wandered? If it has wandered, that is not a problem. That noticing is the practice. I often remind people of this. There is no such thing as failing at awareness. The moment you realize the mind has wandered, you are already aware. This is why the Buddha said, "Be an island unto yourself, be a refuge unto yourself." He was not telling us to isolate from the world. He was pointing us back to something reliable. Your own capacity to know what is happening. Life will continue to be uncertain, bodies will age, relationships will change, loss will come. No teaching can remove these facts. But awareness gives you a place to stand. When you know what is happening in the mind, you are less swept away by it. You may still feel grief, but you are not lost inside it. You may still feel fear, but you are not defined by it. This is a quiet kind of strength. Not dramatic, not heroic, but steady. I have met many older students who say, "I wish I had learned this earlier," and I always tell them the same thing. Earlier is a concept. Now is real. Practice does not ask how old you are. It does not ask what you have done. It only asks, are you willing to look? Imagine carrying a small lantern in the dark. You do not need to light the whole forest. You only need to see the next step. Each moment of noticing is one step. Each pause is a return. You may forget many times. That is normal. You may get lost in thought again and again. That is human. But each time you remember, each time you return, you are strengthening something important. Trust. Trust in your own awareness. This path does not unfold through dramatic breakthroughs. It unfolds through ordinary moments, while washing dishes, while waiting in line, while sitting quietly at night. The practice lives inside your life, not outside it. And slowly, almost without effort, something changes. You are less driven by habit, less frightened by emotion, less identified with every thought. There is more space, more patience, more kindness. Not because you tried to become a better person, but because you learned to see more clearly. This is the refuge the Buddha spoke of, not something you escape into, but something you return to, again and again. Right here, in this moment, in this mind. Everything you need to begin is already present. The only question is gentle. Are you willing to look? Conclusion. A gentle invitation to look. We have walked a long path together, from the mind, to experience, to suffering, to freedom. If there's one message to remember, it is this. Your life is shaped from the inside out. When the mind is unseen, it runs the show. When the mind is seen, freedom begins. You have learned that thoughts are not commands. They arise, they pass. You have seen that emotions are not your identity. They visit, they leave. You have discovered that the self is not a solid thing. It is a living process. And through this seeing, something beautiful appears. Space, space to pause, space to choose, space to care. I want to pause here and thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening with an open heart. If you are still here, something important has already happened. You have recognized value, not as a theory, but as something you can live. Have you noticed how even a small moment of awareness changes everything? A breath, a pause. What might happen if you practice this tomorrow just once, while walking, while listening, while feeling something difficult? Would you be willing to try? You do not need to become someone new, you only need to notice. This path does not ask for perfection. It asks for sincerity. Each moment of awareness is already a success. I truly appreciate you for sharing this time with me. Your presence matters. If these teachings touched you, please consider subscribing to Son.Mindfulness. Your support allows this channel to continue. I invite you to share your thoughts below. What did you notice about your own mind today? Your words may help someone else feel less alone. I wish you good health, peace in your heart, happiness in your days. May good fortune meet you gently on your path. Until we meet again, keep looking kindly.